Hello, and welcome to the Christian Habits Podcast. This is the podcast that will help you break free from your strongholds, draw closer to God, and develop habits that will help you love God and others better. And now, here's your host, Barb Raveling.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have all of you guys here today. I'm really excited to have Mary DeMuth here today, and we are going to be talking about parenting your wayward adult kids with joy. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Mary. She is an international speaker, a podcaster, the author of over 40 books. I can't even imagine writing that many books, fiction and nonfiction, including The Day I Met Jesus. And through God's healing, Mary has overcome a difficult past to become an authentic example of what it means to live a brand new story. She loves to help others restory their lives through the books she writes. Mary lives in Texas with her husband of 30 years and is mom to 3 adult children. Well, welcome to the podcast, Mary.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Good. And I was really excited when I heard about Mary's new book. It's called Love, Pray, and Listen. Because I've actually had quite a few of you guys, you listeners, writing to me and saying you'd like to have a book on parenting adult children. Some of you had kids who've lost, gone away from their faith, or you might have had kids who aren't even talking to you anymore. And so we're gonna talk about some of those topics today. So, Mary, I know the message of your book, it hits a tender spot for a lot of parents and the fears of many more. Would you be willing to share a little bit of your story and why you wrote this book?
Sure. So several years ago, I was in a prayer loop of a mom whose joy rose and fell, and mostly fell, on the decisions of her adult children. And I kind of made a little decision at that point, thinking, I don't want to be like that. I don't want, to be kind of hijacked by whatever decisions my adult kids are making. And so then, of course, it's easy to be an armchair quarterback. And then I became a parent of adult children, and I was like, oh, this is hard. So my working out of that and learning to have joy despite whatever my adult children choose has been kind of the outcropping of this book, and why it came to be, because I began just to study what would it look like to have a fulfilled, joyful life, no matter what's going on around you and what your kids are choosing.
That's interesting. So a lot of it, when we have kids that, don't do what we're kind of hoping they'll do in life, is relating to our kids, but a lot of it is also how we still be joyful in the midst of that. Sounds like what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm not saying be a Pollyanna and just pretend, everything's awesome. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, there's a chapter in the book about the importance of walking through lament and grief. I think a lot of times because it's kind of a cultural issue as well, we keep pretty quiet about it. We feel guilty, or there's something we did wrong in our parenting, so we don't share it, and consequently, we don't grieve it. And that makes that holding on to stress and sadness a lot longer. My advocacy is that people would grieve it first and talk to others about it in a safe place.
Right. Yeah. I was always surprised when I found out that people were reluctant to share that. But I think especially if you tend to get your identity from parenting your kids, it might be harder to share that. Or I don't know, why do people not want to share about that?
I think we were sold a little bit of a bill of goods through parenting books. And even though the parenting book would never say, if you do these 7 steps, your kids are guaranteed to, come out on the other end as Christ followers. But we kind of thought it, and it was kind of promised. And so when they don't come out on the other side and they're making decisions that maybe embarrass us or that we don't approve of, then we can feel ashamed that we must have done something wrong. And, the church can be kind of judgy. So one of the reasons why we don't share is we're afraid what our friends might think. They might think, oh, well, then what was going on in that house? Well, I personally am a very terrible example of this idea, because I was raised by wolves and I met Jesus. So, there's no correlation between, how you were raised necessarily and how you turn out. We can't take credit for it, but nor can we beat ourselves up over the head about it.
Yeah, I've noticed, maybe in the past, more kids, if they were raised Christian at home, would continue being Christian. But I think especially nowadays with the influence of the internet, I mean, there's so many things that you can get caught up with in the internet as far as doubts about your faith. They're just, things like pornography, so many things that can lead you astray. And I'd hate to be a kid nowadays navigating through all that. It's not surprising that so many struggle. But I do like that lament that you talked about in your book, and we don't have time to go into that in this discussion, but I'm interested to try it. I haven't tried it yet, but it's interesting. Mary gives this process in the book about lamenting. She compares it to the Psalms, and I am looking forward to giving that a try and seeing what I think about it. In fact, I don't know many people who have had all their kids leave the house and still following God. Do you know that many families today where most of them have left the house and still follow God, or at least follow him the way you follow him?
Most parents are dealing with kids who are deconstructing. And so there's not a lot of like, oh, all three of my kids are following Jesus. There's maybe some are, some aren't, but there's not a lot where all of them are.
Yeah. And what do you mean by just deconstructing? Because we hear that all the time nowadays. What does that mean?
There's a couple ways to view that. I think in some ways we can view it positively in that everyone needs to tear down what they've learned in the past so that they can make faith their own. And so maybe a better analogy, I've heard it said, unbundling. So you're kind of unbundling what is cultural versus what is actual Christianity. And then you rebundle with historic Christianity. But some people deconstruct to oblivion. So in other words, they question, and they then walk away from the faith. And so it can mean either of those two things. It could be a positive thing or a negative thing.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. And you do talk in the book about love, pray, and listen. So I think, when you read a book like this, you kind of think, oh, this will be a book to show me how to help lead my kids back to God. But we can't always do that, right? And your advice is love, pray, and listen. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, the title came because I asked myself, what can I do? And I realized I can't control, I can't micromanage, I can't force, but I can love. No one can tell me I can't. And I can pray. No one can stop me from doing that. And if I'm still in a relationship with my adult kid, I absolutely can listen. And so those are the things we can do as parents. Once they've left the house, once they're adults, they are making their way in the world, and it is time for us to take our hands off. It's a very helpless feeling, but I think it is the reality of how it's been all along. We never really did have control. There was this kind of veneer of control that we thought we had because we were bigger than them for a long time. And we enacted rules and regulations and things like that and punishments for not, obeying the rules. But really, the Lord is the one in control. And so there is a great amount of relinquishment that happens when they walk out the door for the last time.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is accepting what you need to accept to have peace and letting go of that control. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what does the praying look like?
Well, there have been times where my praying looks like falling on the kitchen floor because I couldn't get low enough and weeping. So praying can look however it looks in the instant. Sometimes it's just a real strong sense that you're supposed to intercede for your adult kid. Sometimes it is the crying out with words that you don't even have words because you're just crying. And it can mean praying that the lure of the world, the kind of like farce of that would be taken away so that kids can begin to see that all those empty promises will end in nothing. There's just a lot of different ways that we can pray. And, it can be a little tricky if you have a wayward kid to say, hey, I'm praying for you. I try not to say that. I just try to do it.
Right. Yeah, I feel the same way about that. Another thing you talk about under the love, I mean, your whole book is kind of set up around 1 Corinthians 13 with each chapter, like one of those little love points or whatever they are. So can you tell me a little bit about how you set that up and how we can love them with the 1 Corinthians 13 love?
Well, it's fascinating to me. And this was just all credit to the Lord, because as I was thinking about writing this book, I always like to have some sort of structure or skeleton to hang it on. And he reminded me of this passage. And this passage, the love is patient, love is kind passage, We share it a lot at weddings, which is not wrong or improper, but Paul was writing it to a broken church full of broken relationships. And so when you know the context of why he's writing that, it's perfect for a parent of an adult kid, especially a struggling adult kid, because there's a relational wound there, or there's, some brokenness is happening. And so unpacking the Greek and what does it really mean that love does not boast? What does it really mean? And how does that apply to us today? It was very, very not only helpful for me as a parent of adult kids, but as a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah. I got a lot out of those chapters and the way you brought that back to 1 Corinthians 13. You also talk about listening to your kids. So can you tell us how we can be better listeners?
I think we forget that we've had 18 years to impart and that usually our kids will assume correctly what we think about a situation. And so we need to err on the side of curiosity, kind of a holy curiosity of who is this interesting person in front of me? One way that I've described it in the book is to look at your adult child as a neighbor instead of as your adult child. Because if you look at them as your adult child, you have all this baggage from the past and you're like, I changed her diaper and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at them like, oh my goodness, a new neighbor has moved into my neighborhood, how would I love them? I don't know if they're a Christian or not, but I'm just going to listen to their life. I'm going to bring them cookies when they're sad. I'm going to, go to the potluck on the corner. I'm going to listen to them. We might not have, the same political views, but I'm going to listen because I'm going to be fascinated by the person that God has created. And that has really helped me to just become a lot more fascinated by my adult kids and just curious.
Yeah. So what would you look like on a practical level? Because I love that whole idea of being fascinated and curious questions. But you know how sometimes you're in the moment, you're on this topic, and it's so easy just to jump in and start saying things without even thinking about it. So how are you able, if that's the way you normally operate, how are you able to step back and change your reaction so you are more curious rather than jumping in to defend or put out your own point of view or whatever it is?
I think the word consensus will be your friend. And this is something we learned when we were church planters in France. So we would go to someone's house and we'd have a meal, and people would argue with one another throughout the whole meal. In fact, some people would argue, they would take the opposite side that they just were arguing just for fun, because they like the idea of having a good, discussion. And then they would kiss each other on the cheek and leave. And I was all stressed out as an American. So because an American thinks there has to be a winner and a loser to a conversation like this. There's no common ground. There's no consensus. It's just, and the French think, if I can have a really intellectual conversation and get all sides of a story, then it's a win. So that has really helped me. So now instead of thinking, for instance, if we're talking about abortion, huge issue, very sticky topic. And if I think of consensus, one of the things we practice around our table when our kids come back home is, ask a lot of questions. What can we agree on in this very, very divisive issue? Well, when we kept pulling it back away and looking at it far away from, the actual issue and without emotion, we were able to all have a consensus of, we really want to see women who are in an unplanned pregnancy flourish. And that was the common ground that we could come to. Now, we're not on common ground on other parts of that argument, and that's okay. But I think it's intellectually more stimulating and more interesting to try to find that common ground rather than see it as, I'm going to win and you're going to lose, and my opinion is right and your opinion is wrong.
Yeah, I like that. And I think too, sometimes, and this even with, regular people, not your adult children, some people are only around people that think the way they do.
Right.
And you can have great value being around other people and trying to see each other's side. So I can see that. I do have one curious question, because when you're having those discussions in France, it seems to me like when discussions go awry, it's when one person starts thinking of the other person as a total moron. They're just so dumb. So were you able to have those discussions over there in France where people were lively, but they weren't thinking those things?
It's such a different culture. So they wouldn't have even framed it that way. They would have framed it in their mind as, I just want to learn something new.
Okay.
And that's a whole different way to approach a conversation versus we tend to be like, this is the issue. I am correct on it. And it is my job to make sure that loser over there knows the right way to think. And I'm going to tell them. So it's just a different way of looking at things.
Oh, right. Okay. So as soon as you do start calling them loser, I mean, there is that passage, when Jesus was saying about if you say crazy, whatever, right. I can't remember what it is.
Fool, you fool. Yeah.
Yeah, you fool. So Jesus doesn't want us to do that. So we definitely don't want to get to that point. So I like that idea of being curious and trying to see the other point of view. And what I found too, if people really disagree with you, the best way for them to change the way they think, or for us to change the way we think, is to ask questions. Because when you ask questions, people are like, oh, well, I wonder what I do think about that, or, things like that. So that might be the best help anyway.
Yeah. Just to be curious.
Yeah. Okay. So that's just like trial and error. You find yourself, going astray and you're like, okay, next time I'm going to try to do better. Is that kind of what you do? Next time I'm going to try and be different.
Yeah. And I think, we forget that we always have the opportunity to apologize. And if you want to have a strong relationship with your adult kid, it is definitely okay not to, be so sad about, what you did wrong that it crushes you, but to realistically evaluate it with the Lord. And if you've said something or done something, even in the distant past, it's not too late to say you're sorry. Hey, back then when I said those things, I really regret it now. And I shouldn't have done it that way. And I hope you can forgive me.
That's good. And besides arguing too, sometimes we're giving too much advice. So what would you say about giving too much advice?
I think it's important to remember what we were like in our 20s. That's really helped me because it just feels pandering when a parent is giving advice to an adult child, and it kind of just goes in one ear and out the other. And so if you didn't like it when you were in your 20s, why do you think they would like it? Now, we can always give advice when asked. So I wait for those open doors, and my kids call me a lot and say, what do I do about this? And what about this financial decision? And I'm happy to give my advice because they're soliciting it. But just to kind of come out and say, this is what you should do, is still parenting them, and they're adults now.
Right. And I think what we have to do is we have to recognize they're not those little kids anymore. They're in our home. They're adults who are mature and, can do things on their own. So it's almost like we have to change our perspective of them, maybe to get ourselves to stop giving advice. Yeah.
Right. We still see them running around in a diaper, and they have a job and they pay bills. So it's different.
That's right.
Two different things.
Not our kids anymore. You do talk too in the book about making your home like a safe haven, someplace where they're always going to want to come back. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
That was my goal as a parent when they were under my roof, that my kids would be wildly enthusiastic about coming home from school or from wherever they were. And that has not changed. And, we've had, our kids are all on interesting journeys, of course. And one particular kid ended up contacting us during an extreme crisis. And I was so grateful when it happened, because it proved that all that work that we had done to create a haven, even though we may not agree with this child, we may have had arguments, we view things very differently. When the rubber met the road and the crisis came, we were the first call. And so having that, and I think part of that was just my husband and I both are from, we're pioneer parents. We weren't raised in Christian homes necessarily. And we had a lot of pain enacted toward us by our parents during our 20s. And it was just devastating. And so that negative example also helped me to ask the question, am I acting the way that they did because I didn't like the way that felt and it broke my heart?
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, sometimes it helps to have a negative example from your past. When you think, I don't want to be that way.
Yeah.
I was interested in one thing you said in the book, 'cause I've also noticed it. You talked about parents feeling compelled to change their theology to match their wayward child's decisions. So how can parents stay true to their Christian convictions while still loving their children who might now believe differently than they do?
I think it is a fallacy that is quite preached in the world's economy. That is, if you love me, you will not only approve of what I do, but you will applaud what I do. But that's not biblical love. Jesus never did that. He always confronted in love. When something was going wrong, he didn't let it slide. He definitely talked about it. So his love was love and truth together. If you have too much love, you have license. If you have too much truth, then you have legalism. And so somewhere along there is a narrow pathway that we're asked to walk as parents. I tell the story in the book of a family who had a same-sex attracted child. And they were looking to find other parents who are walking through all that with them. And they never found a set of parents that didn't change their theology. Wow. All of the parents that they found did change their theology to be same-sex affirming, however you want to say that. And that's a difficult issue. So I don't want to die on that hill. But I have learned, and this family learned, that you can actually, believe it or not, still love someone and not agree with their choices. And think about it God loves me, and I'm sure he doesn't agree with all my choices either. So, so anyway, that's kind of how I answer that, or how I've worked through that.
Yeah, it's good. And I've seen things go more that way, where the parents have changed their theology or even, left their faith. But I think in the old days, and maybe it still happens now too, parents would sometimes say, well, my kid isn't doing this. He's not a Christian anymore, so I'm just going to disown them. Do you still see that happening at all today?
Not as much, thankfully, because our generation of parents is different than the generation before. And it's really why I wrote this book, because when my mom dropped me off at college, that was the end of her parenting career. She was like, goodbye, but we parents are much more, we want to be more connected to our kids. We want to have that elongated relationship. And so we are more apt to be connected to them versus, a parent that just washed their hands when they went off to college.
Yeah. And, I think of the prodigal son too story. And you mentioned that in the book at the end, but I was thinking the dad, he didn't tell the kid to leave. The kid made the choice to leave on his own. And then the dad welcomed him back, and the dad didn't try and talk him out of it either.
Right. He didn't chase him either. Once he left, he didn't chase after the child.
Yeah. He didn't chase after. And I guess that's happening too. And I know a lot of you who are listening have had this experience where, sometimes you're still communicating with the child and it doesn't, lead you away from each other. But sometimes, especially in this cancel culture, there is no relationship. The child has decided not to have a relationship with you. So what do you do in those situations when, somebody's child said, hey, I'm not going to be around you anymore because of your beliefs or for whatever reason it is?
That's such a hard thing, this parental estrangement, parental abandonment. And I just want to say to anyone walking through that, I'm really sorry. And it is excruciating. And that's where the listening part of the love, pray, listen kind of breaks down, because if you're not in a relationship, you can't listen, but you still can love and pray. And you can entrust them to the Lord, and you can love them from afar, and you can pour out your heart to the Lord about them. And that is just a hard place. It's a deep discipline, and it is not a simple or easy solution. There really is no easy solution unless there's reconciliation, and we just cannot control that. And that's what's hard.
Right. And that's another time where we have to accept what appears unacceptable and love from afar. And I suppose make sure that we don't shift into resentment or anything like that. I think that could be a possibility with that. So,
yeah, the prodigal father loved from afar, and he must have dealt with any resentment he would have had because he welcomed him back joyfully. And I think that's the kind of heart work that you can do, is say, Lord, I want to be at a place that if my child walks back over the hill and comes, that I would be willing to throw a party and not just be bitter and angry and push them away.
Yeah, that's good. So keep renewing your mind if you're struggling with that. And also keep renewing your mind. Maybe I would think you could prepare, like say if you're going to be around kids, you could kind of think about it before you're around them. I mean, maybe you can't if they just call and the phone rings, but if you know somebody's going to be coming, you might have a chance of getting into arguments. You could kind of prepare yourself mentally before they come home, do you think?
Yes. I mean, rehearsing is really important, and asking God to help you exercise self-control and ask God for the discipline of when to be quiet. That's a really important one too, because I found personally that I really enjoy my friendships where someone asks me a question and then they sit back and listen versus just jumping in. And so if I want that with my kids, if I want to have a haven-like home, then I'm going to be the person who asks questions and then sits back and listens and actively listens.
That's good. Well, I just think everything you said has just been so helpful. I love your book. I've been looking for somebody to interview on this topic for a long time. And I really love Mary's book. I think if this is something you guys are struggling with, she has so much help in this book. And also remember that probably a lot of the people maybe most, are also struggling with it. So be willing to share it with a friend if this is something that's hard for you, so you have some support in the journey. And where can people find you online, Mary?
Yeah, so they can go to marydemuth.com, and I'm also on socials at @marydemuth. And I have a freebie for your listeners. It's marydemuth.com/LPL, which stands for Love, Pray, Listen. And there's 52 prayers, one a week, that you can pray for your adult children with blanks in them. And this actually, they don't even have to be adult children, but they're just those kinds of prayers. If you're getting to that place in your prayer life where you're like, I don't know what to pray, they can go to marydemuth.com/LPL.
Wow, I love that. That'd be a super helpful resource. So the book is called Love, Pray, Listen by Mary DeMuth. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Mary. It's
been my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank all of you guys for being here. It was great to have you here. I hope you have a good week, and I will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Christian Habits Podcast. If you'd like more help with stopping and starting habits, check out Barb's blog at www.barbraveling.com.